Greetings, it's the Digital Dog. Today I have a short tutorial video on ICC output profiles entitled Not All ICC Profiles Are Created Equally. So that's a bold statement. Let's see if that happens to be the case. And if so, how can we evaluate our own ICC profiles going out to our own printers to see whether or not they have the quality that we require? This is what I'm going to cover. A basic anatomy of ICC profiles. It's important to understand what's going on inside these little guys in terms of their structure when talking about whether or not we're getting an acceptable ICC profile. Why there are differences in profile quality and color rendering. The meat and potatoes is how to evaluate an ICC output profile. I'm going to give you some tips and point you in the direction of some output ready files that you can use to evaluate how well your ICC profiles are performing. Some examples of good and not so good CAM profiles and custom profiles on actual printed output. So you're going to see actual photographs of prints made with various profiles so that I can show you what I consider to be a good ICC profile and a not so good ICC profile. So let's talk about the basic structure of an output profile. They're quite a bit more complex than a scanner or camera profile or a display profile. So it's necessary to talk about the fact that these output ICC profiles for going out to a print, have multiple tables for multiple rendering intents. There are three tables. One's the colorimetric table, one's the perceptual table, and one's the saturation table. The absolute and relative colorimetric rendering intents share the same table. They're identical except for how they affect the mapping of paper white. Within each rendering intent, you're going to find that there are two tables. One affects the actual output going to your printer, and the other table affects the soft proof. In a perfect world, the two would be in sync. So, for example, if you were to print out something that had a very saturated blue sky on your inkjet printer and you looked at the soft proof, assuming that your display calibration were well done, the two would be in sync. They would match within reason of the technology differences between an emissive display and a reflective print. Unfortunately, some profiles produce tables that are not in sync, so you might get a perfectly acceptable output and a soft proof that doesn't match, or vice versa. But it's important to understand that there are two tables. One controls the output, one controls the preview. I've got a URL up on screen on another video I did on display calibration called Why Are My Prints Too Dark? This covers more than just dark prints compared to what you see on screen and talks about ways that you can adjust the calibration of your display to get a better match between the two tables. But if the tables are greatly out of sync, you're going to have a particular problem that even a display calibration is not going to be able to rectify. Now, in terms of the perceptual rendering intent table, it's important to understand that there are no rules on how this table is built. Differing packages are going to produce different results, even if we send the same measured data from a printer to both products. This is kind of akin to how film in the old days was produced. Some photographers preferred the way Ektachrome appeared versus Velvia versus Agfachrome. The film manufacturers were doing what we could say is perceptual rendering. They produced a color rendering that they felt their customers would prefer. So again, you could send the same measured data to two different profile packages and examine how they conduct a perceptual rendering, and they can be quite different. And we'll look at some of the options in a minute as to why these products produce differing results. And in terms of a relative colorimetric table, in a perfect world, two profiles would produce the same results from the same measured data going off to the same printer, but that isn't the case either. So again, not all profiles are created equally. So why are there other differences in profile quality? Let's take a quick look here at some of the parameters. First of all, the number of patches printed and measured. If we had the time and the energy and the ability, we would measure 16.7 million device values going off to a printer. And then we would have no guesswork within the profile as to how that printer produces color. Unfortunately, doing that would take an enormous amount of time, and the resulting profile would probably be larger in file size than most of the images that you're editing. So what happens is we have to take a subset of colors. The software doesn't really know anything about the printer at this point. It just knows how to spit out a bunch of color patches. And we have to measure them, and then a lot of extrapolation has to be conducted in how the profile then decides how that output profile or how that printer defines color. The quality of the target generation varies from product to product. So for example, if I decided that I wanted to measure, say, 2,000 color patches from product A versus product B, in most cases, those products are going to produce 2,000 slightly different sets of color patches. So some do a better job than others in creating these particular color patches. And again, short of measuring millions of colors, we have to measure perhaps 1,500, 1,700 patches, and then the profile has to figure out, well, what am I going to do with all the other different color values in between? The quality of the spectrophotometer is going to play a large role here. Some are better than others. Some spectrophotometers will measure a single patch multiple times and average those readings. So for example, the device I'm using, the auto spectrophotometer from X-Rite called an I1 ICIS, measures about 100 samples per second. This can be useful when you're dealing with a device that might produce slightly different colors over a very small patch size. So multiple patch readings and averaging is useful. The settings used to build a profile, especially for the perceptual table, as we'll see in a minute, play a role as well. This is why not all profiles are created equally. And one of the biggest differences is the color engine used to build the profile. In some examples I'm going to show you in a minute, I've actually used the same number of color patches, the same spectrophotometer, and I've saved off a measured color file that I can feed to two different profile packages. So up until the point that I feed these spectral data measurements into these two products, everything is identical. And yet we'll see slight differences between two products simply because the color engines used to come up with the math to build the profiles are going to be different. In terms of perceptual rendering options, I just want to quickly show you some of the options that are available in two different products and how that might affect the resulting quality of the profile when using a perceptual table. So for example, on the left, you're seeing a product called Copra, and for example, there's a slider for the compression of chroma. I can account for optical brighteners, or there's a checkbox called brightener compensation. And on the right, I have a few more settings in a product called I1 Profiler from X-Rite, and you can see that I have a contrast, saturation, and neutralized gray sliders. Those sliders alone are going to play a role in how the perceptual table is built, let alone some of the advanced features like the chromatic adaptation and so forth. So the point here is that the same data can be used to build profiles, but depending on the color engine and the options used, you may get differing results. Some other options, for example, on the left, you see a setting called default lighting. Most ICC profiles assume that the print will be viewed under a D50 illuminant. I'm not going to go into the details here about D50 and how the fact that the really only D50 illuminant that exists is 93 million miles away. One of the issues that we have is when we view our prints under different illuminants, they aren't standard, they do differ, and this can affect how we perceive the print. So one of the things that I can do in I1 Profiler is I can pick a standard illuminant like D50, or I can pick D65 or any of the other standard illuminants. I can also click on the daylight temperature drop-down menu and just enter a value in Kelvin. Or I can hook up a handheld spectrophotometer and actually measure the illuminant that I'll be viewing my prints under, and that will be used when the profile is built, rather than assuming D50. On the right, I have another set of options in case I'm working with a paper that might have a large degree of optical brighteners. This is a visual process where a reference is printed out, it's viewed under the viewing booth that We will be looking at our prints, and then I can enter values for what appears to be neutral to me when I view this paper under this illuminant, and the profile will be adjusted for such viewing conditions. So again, these are some of the options that will make a difference in how an ICC profile performs. The other option that I have in I1 Profile is called post-optimization. So essentially, when I build a profile, I send 1,728 color patches to the device, I measure them, I build a profile, I might make a few prints and look at it, see how it's performing. But then what I can do is I can send another set of patches to the software. These patches, in this case, 2,368 specific color patches that I've specified, are used to optimize the original profile. Now, what you're seeing here on screen are two reports out of ColorThink Pro. The top is the original profile, the bottom is the optimized profile. And just to give you an example of what optimization can do in some cases, you'll notice that the gamut volume has increased in size, as reported by ColorThink Pro. Instead of a gamut volume of 602,053, the optimized profile has a slightly larger color gamut. This has a gamut volume of 604,263. Not a lot, but a slight improvement in gamut volume. The other thing to look at are the curves of the resulting profile. And as you can see, if you compare the closeness of the curves from the two profiles, the optimized profile is a little bit more linear, especially in the green plot that you see from ColorThink Pro versus the optimized profile. This is geeky, and it's really just a way to show that, yes, optimizing the profile did make a slight difference between the before and after. But really what you want to do is make prints with both profiles and see what the results are. And I find that in many cases, an optimized profile produces a little bit better gray balance and does tweak the profile, produces a slightly better result. Now, testing ICC profile quality. There are basically two ways we can do this. One is colorimetric, which gives us a set of numbers, and the other is visual, and that's what we're going to discuss today. Maybe in the future I'll do a video on how one can test the so-called accuracy of the ICC profile using a colorimetric process where we measure colors and patches and bring them into software. We're going to talk about simply viewing output prints from our various profiles and coming up with a determination whether or not they're the quality we need or not. And one of the things that we want to do is use what's called a color reference image. The first two URLs are color reference images that are free that you can download from my website and use for print. They were designed to test how well a profile is performing, and I'll go over that. That's sort of the meat and potatoes of the video. You might want to look into the Roman 16 test suite. I'll show you what those look like, but here's an example of 4 of them. They're really superb for outputting images and examining them closely to see what your profile is really doing. You do want to test both the perceptual and the relative colorimetric rendering intents with all the reference images. For that matter, you might want to test the saturation rendering intent, because if it produces the results that you desire on a print, it's fair game. Before you view these images under your viewing booth, you do want to let them dry down. So here are the 2 color reference images you can download from my website. The image on the left is all from raw data converted into ProPhoto RGB. You can also see that I have 3 synthetic images in this image, and I'll talk about why those are useful. There's a Granger rainbow here in both test images, although the image on the right is in Adobe RGB. What you can see below is one of the toughest sets of synthetic images, these 14 synthetic balls created by Bill Atkinson. Originally there were 28, and you can still download those. Over on the right, we've got skin tones, a Macbeth color checker, neutrals, and I'll go into detail on what you want to look for. But these are examples of the 2 color references that you might want to start working with before you actually use your own images to test a profile. Real quickly, this is the Roman 16 suite, and as you can see, we've got a whole group of different skin tones. We have neutrals, we have pastels, saturated colors, red, cyan, blue. brown, green, dark green, so on and so forth. These are just amazingly useful test images for evaluating output. Also notice on either side of each image are some squares, some solid squares that were extracted from the image, and those are useful too, as you'll see coming up in the next slide. So here's what you want to look for. First of all, you want to look for the neutrality of grays, and the illuminant, of course, is going to be somewhat critical. And when you look at these images under a viewing condition that you've set up for looking at your prints, you do want to consider issues of metameric failure and the role of OBAs. Down below, I've got some text that you can read at your leisure. I want to use the term metameric failure because I've heard a lot of photographers talk about looking at prints and saying, my prints suffer from metamerism. And that's not exactly accurate. Metameric failure is a much better term to use. Metamerism is actually a very useful attribute, and it doesn't apply in this particular discussion. We want to look at the linearity of gradients, both color and black and white. So in other words, if we're looking at a step wedge that ranges from pure white to pure black, we want to see that not only is it neutral, but we want to see that it gradates in a linear fashion, that there isn't abrupt areas that are too dark or too light, that it's a smooth, gradual, even, linear transition from black to white or cyan to magenta or yellow to white. And we'll see this in an upcoming slide. Purity of colors. This is very important. Blues are particularly difficult and something that you want to look for. In the old days, it was very common to find ICC output profiles where saturated blues would shift to a magenta cast. It's not quite a problem today. The color engines are better by and large, but this is something that you want to look for. Obviously, if you've got a very saturated blue sky in an image, it should look blue. It shouldn't look magenta. Detail in saturated colors. In the gamut test file that you saw previously, there's an image of very saturated cloth. What you want to be able to see is the texture of that cloth. You want saturated colors, but you don't want a big blob of color that doesn't show the detail in those cloths. So that's something to look forward to. The torture test now are the synthetic images like the 14 balls that Bill Atkinson built or the Granger rainbow. You shouldn't expect perfection, and you need to keep in mind that what profiles have to do when they're mapping their conversions from the source to the destination is they have to weigh saturation over brightness and hue. Where are they going to weigh how they convert these particular colors? Is saturation more important than brightness? Is hue more important than saturation? Again, goes back to this issue with the blue in the sky. If they're really trying to get that blue sky super saturated and at that expense, the hue shifts magenta, that's not a good thing. If the sky is a nice pure blue, but it's not as saturated as you want, that could particularly be an issue. So these are the things to keep in mind. Colorimetric analysis is something that is useful. And as I said, I might do a video covering this, but ultimately the proof is in the prints, and that's why you want to work with color reference images and then your own images to see how well these various profiles perform. And so this is what, again, you want to look for. I've talked about it in the other slide in terms of neutrality and linearity. As you can see, the step wedge up above. Ideally, we would like to see each one of those 21 steps separate from the other. We'd like them to be neutral. In terms of the synthetic images, we've got the Granger rainbow and the 14 circular balls. This is a very telling way of looking at how the profile is going to weigh saturation versus hue versus brightness. I'll show you an example in a minute. Purity of hue through saturation. As you can see in the test images, we have saturated yellow, red, green, magenta, cyan, and so on, gradiating from pure saturation to white. And what you want to make sure of, like the neutrality step above, is that it's a smooth gradation, that we don't see color shifts, we don't see banding. And again, you may not get perfection, but this is kind of what you want to look for in various profiles. You want to see that that blue stays blue from its full saturation to its least saturation, gradiating into lightness. Skin tones, of course, are very, very important, and that's why we find them in all of the reference images that are suggested that you use for testing. So this is actual photographs of the same image. It's the Roman 16 girl in blue close-up. And as you can see, the image on the left is a CAN profile. The image on the right is a custom profile. And these are the sort of things you want to look at. This is a pretty major difference between these two particular profiles. As you can see, the image on the left, it doesn't have much shadow detail. The blues, the saturated blues, seem to clip to black. They don't look blue, they look black. So this is the sort of thing that you want to be looking at in actual images. And as I said, these are two prints output using the same RGB file, sent out to an Epson P600 printer and photographed on a light stand. That's why you might see some little scuffs and scratch marks on the print. Again, these are actual prints as well. Over on the left, what I've done is I've built a custom profile. I've measured the 1728 patches, and I've sent those patches, or the patch data, the measured data, to two different profile packages, I1 Profiler from X-Rite and Copra. And then you can see that there are some differences, even with a relative colorimetric rendering intent, between those two profiles. So same data, same measurements, slightly different results. And of course, they are both, in my opinion, vastly superior to the CAN profile we see from Epson on the far right. This is the profile where we saw the Roman 16 blue image, where all of our saturated blues kind of map to black. And that's really visible in the print seen on the far right, where we have the two sets of blue balls. On the left, we have a ball that gradates from pure white to dark blue, and the opposite on the second example that Bill has created. And as you can see on the CAN profile, the image on the far right, it just maps completely almost to pure black. There's virtually no gradation, and it's all just a solid black. So that's not what we want to see. When you compare it to the profile above, you can see how we map from pure dark black, almost blue, to a lighter blue. We do see it gradate out, and we see it doesn't look like a black ball as we see from the CAN profile. If you look at the CAN profile image where it gradates from white to dark blue, you can see some banding occurring. And again, this is the result of the profile engine sort of weighing, well, what's the best approach here? It doesn't know this is an image of a ball. It just understands individual solid color pixels. So it has to make some sort of decisions as how it's going to map these particular colors. You see a little bit of a banding in the blue ball from the custom profile, but it isn't quite so bad. It's interesting, they're both kind of in the same area, but what you're seeing really is the vast differences between how these two profiles take the same RGB data and map them to the output color space for a printer and the result of that print. Anyway, that's about it. Thank you for your time.